I'm going to talk about why the road to freedom and privacy and everything we want is paved with better security and better tools. So just as a quick intro, I've been a cypherpunk since the 1990s. There was a mailing list that was incredibly useful. It created a lot of the ideas that we're still implementing today. Basically, several hundred to several thousand people later on were on a mailing list and discussed what would happen if we had anonymous electronic cash and high security computing systems and end user trust. I was really fortunate to get involved in '93 when I was like 14 years old. And when you're a teenager, you have almost no power over anything in the world. Like, you just sort of, your parents have control, the schools have control, big institutions, government, like everyone else has control. You have no control over anything. And the most exciting thing was discovering this mailing list where I discovered cryptography, I discovered Cycrypt, I discovered Bruce Schneier's applied cryptography book, a bunch of stuff like that, where an individual can build some sort of mathematical construct that can stand up to not merely their school or adults or individuals, but to basically everyone in the world together working against them for not just right then, but actually for millions or tens of millions of years. So it was a really interesting thing and sort of changed how I thought about what's possible given science and technology. And of course, there's a lot of caveats to this cool technology letting you do this stuff, but fundamentally it is an example of what's possible and lots of amazing stuff that's possible. I've done some sort of interesting stuff, as was alluded to. I was on this list and I built a data store, an uncensorable data store that Ross Anderson had developed or conceptualized. Adam Back built one as well. Lots of other people did stuff. I got to meet Tim May. I met Hal Finney, a bunch of other people that were early cypherpunks working on cool stuff. And basically got to be part of all the discussions where it was what's possible once we have these things. I went to a conference. I went to MIT early, and I didn't have any money, so I couldn't really pay for anything, and I was working to like pay my tuition and stuff. I spoke at a conference that the First Digital Commerce Society of Boston, where someone presented an idea, where I presented an idea and someone else presented an idea, Ian Grigg, who went on to start R3. Basically, what would happen if we built the Chaumian blinded token system and just deployed it. And some people in the audience that had created eGold said, we'll give you guys $200,000 in cash if you'll start exactly what you guys built or talked about in your conference talk next week. And I was like, sure. I bought a plane ticket, one-way plane ticket to the Caribbean. And this was back when ITAR was preventing everything. And basically, there's a legal way to get around it by writing an academic paper and letting a Dutch citizen next to me download that paper and then implement it and all sorts of stuff like that. It was a very interesting project. I did that. Then I did the world's first offshore data haven in the North Sea, Havenco on Sealand. It was a World War II abandoned anti-aircraft platform that the British had built and just sort of left abandoned. Some pirate radio guys took it over in the 60s, turned it into its own sovereign country, and we started hosting stuff like casinos, stock market newsletters, games, all sorts of stuff that wasn't allowed in any other jurisdiction. So that was a really fun time, and that was during the first .com explosion of like 1998 to 2000. And then when it exploded in 2001, I did some other projects, and then I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area and wanted to get as far away from there as possible due to a relationship failing apart. And I met some people on this old blogging site, LiveJournal, that were Iraqi expats from the 70s. They said, hey, come to Iraq. Iraq is going to be so safe after the US invades and gets rid of Saddam, which it actually was for like 6 months, that you'll come, every other Iraqi expat's going to come and set up their own ISP here. So we're going to set up the first internet exchange in Baghdad and let them all peer in Baghdad. So we rented the Syrian Ba'ath Party of Iraq's headquarters, which they had vacated because the US had invaded and kicked them out. And we lived in this house out in Baghdad with a bunch of Kurdish guys on our roof with security and sold satellite internet, ran exchanges, all sorts of fun stuff like that. I was driving around an old BMW E34s, like 5 Series, 1989 to 1993, and got to learn about all this stuff. I had no military background, no government connections or anything else. It was just like, just do this. And they handed me a Browning high power at the airport, and I bought some local stuff and just drove around and did some cool stuff. So that was a pretty fun time. It turned into more and more boring, but also more and more technically interesting stuff. As I did that, I moved on to the bases and I started selling like microwave stuff and some more satellite capacity. Did that for basically most of 2003 to 2010. It was fun, got to see a lot of places that I honestly don't really want to ever see again, and got to learn about how government works from the inside as a contractor, and how the biggest misconception I had from like an outsider who just mistrusted government generally, I used to think government was this like monolithic, very malevolent, but also competent force. And it turns out it's actually not. It's actually a bunch of separate individual things where people have their own petty motivations and try to do stuff which ultimately often ends up for bad purposes, but it's not coordinated. And the main thing is it's not coordinated, not so much that it's good or evil. So that was a fun experience. I then did a startup basically using one of the predecessors of Intel SGX, Intel TXT, to build secure remote computing that can basically remotely attest like how secure a program is and run it on a cloud computing thing and do a remote attestation there. So that was pretty fun, and I sold that company to Cloudflare, which at the time was like 10% of the web traffic in the world, turned into like 30% of the traffic. So I got to do product security for a huge fraction of the internet, got to see all the practical attacks that were happening on web stuff, which was really quite fun. Did that for a while, did a startup doing travel laptops, like stuff to go to China and Russia and places like that with a disposable laptop, which then lots of crypto people were using, and a top 10 crypto foundation at the time was a user, so I joined them as CISO and then joined the board and did stuff with them for a while. I moved to Puerto Rico in the middle of that, which is a fun US territory, which has some weird laws, and was sort of working on some staking stuff, and then found Evertas, which is an insurance company, the world's first crypto insurance company, and joined them as CISO and got to do lots of fun stuff there. All in service of the same overall goal of trying to do tools that make it possible to have individual liberty for as many people in the world and make the world better. So I think we all have some fairly common ground. Like all the talks that I've seen so far have been amazing, the talks last year, everything else. We all want basically the same things. It's some disagreements about prioritization and how to get there and distribution and things like that. But we basically all want freedom. We want permissionless innovation. We want people to be able to have prosperity. We want community. There's all sorts of positive things that I don't think really people really have any, there's not really too much to debate about like what things are good. There is prioritization and how to get there, but there's this whole set of things. And the utopian vision, obviously there's a bunch of these, like people have slightly different visions, but fairly common stuff. Unfortunately, what we have today is a fairly different world. We have governments that have been around since, like the structure of governments largely is from the 1800s, the nation state. We have companies, like many of the companies that exist are from the earlier part of last century. We have organizational structures and tools that are built that are basically legacy. Very few things that are new and built today. Even startups, we have companies like Google and Apple and everything else, which you might think are like new companies. These have been around for 20 plus years, and in the case of Apple, far longer than that. And they are the dominant life form. Like if you had an alien that came to Earth and looked around, like what is the primary structure? It would be large corporations and to a second degree nation states. So nothing that's been built recently, nothing that's really built for the world as it exists today. There have been a lot of innovations in the last, I don't know, like 40 years, but they have not really been organizational structure. They've been technology. Technology is the one area that seems to be progressing. Human interactions largely have not changed. Right. You've got dumpster file. If you ever go to like crazy stuff that happens, like I don't know, if you book a flight, like you have this nice web front end to booking something, and you think, oh wow, this is this great application, but it's actually just a front end to a 1960s, 50s, and 70s back-end database that's built in COBOL that does all this stuff like Sabre or a system like that. So all this stuff is basically like sometimes a shiny layer of paint on top of a bunch of really old legacy stuff that is largely different from how you would build it today. So yes. So this is all great, and the first thought is, oh, we should rebuild it, and we should build it better and do everything better. But if you look at the stuff that I would say we collectively, like I'm more involved in cryptocurrency than really any area of technology right now. Probably cryptocurrency, computer security, to some extent hardware security, but general technology. If you look at the stuff that we've actually built over the past, like say 15 years, it's not really that close to what we'd actually want if you were building, if you were designing a perfect system. We've got systems that are basically brittle, that are controlled by monopolies, that are otherwise not really ideal. And you see a whole lot of problems with them. I can focus on the security problems of those because I know them the best, because I look at them all the time, especially the cryptocurrency problems. But this is really just a microcosm of the entire world. You have got reliability systems. You have airlines that go down for weeks at a time because they have an old computer system. It's not because the planes aren't flying. It's because their system to like schedule pilots for flying is built in the the Southwest melted down in the US in around Christmas time because they had a scheduling system for crew that had been built probably in the mid 80s and hadn't been updated since, and basically completely failed. So lots of stuff like that where computing is part of the problem. In cryptocurrency, it's crazy. Like this is the nice thing about quantifying stuff is you can then plot it year versus year. I mean, it's one thing to say like there was this incident, there's this incident, and they're sort of disparate things, and you can't really directly compare them. But if you have an incident that has a dollar value of loss attached to it, you can add that up, and it's like a nice scalar quantity, and you can just add up all the events per year, and it lets you compare things a lot better. And cryptocurrency is one of the most interesting areas of computer security, not so much because it's got fundamentally interesting problems, but really because it has a built-in bug bounty with basically everything. Because if you hack a large cryptocurrency system, you can extract money from it, and that incentivizes people, and it provides a very clear measurement of how that stuff works. And as we see, this really should be scaled by the growth of the industry, but like percentage of assets that have been hacked per year is one thing, but we see billions of dollars of losses, and this actually underestimates it by a fair bit. So just external hacking is a major fact, and these are all systems that the cryptocurrency industry itself has basically built in the last few years, so it's not really so much a blame it on legacy organizations so much as the tools and the software we're building are not really fit for purpose. I mean, the ultimate example here was Vitalik, creator of Ethereum, generally smart guy, generally very aligned with all these goals of building great tools, individual freedom, did this amazing thing called Zuzalu, which is a conference that was in Montenegro for 2 months. It's like a new format of conference where people go to a location for some period of that 2 months and are all living in the same place, and then they have a theme every week and people come and talk about it. And I stopped in for 1 day, but some people were there for a week, some people were there for the full 2 months. He did this stuff. He's basically a very smart guy, probably smarter than all but like 5 people, like in the top maybe 10 people I know worldwide, and he got hacked. His Twitter account got hacked because he had a phone number in his Twitter account which had gotten added when he subscribed to Twitter Blue for some reason, and that re-added the phone number, and someone was able to do a social engineering attack to extract that, and they tweeted as him, or X'd, or whatever it is now, as him, and posted this thing like, buy this NFT, and ended up draining in excess of $700,000 of money from other people by doing this to them. And if that's an example of one of the smartest people in the world running a system that was built relatively recently and having that happen, and a system that basically he had built, it's a bad indictment of where we are in terms of security these days. So there's a lot of problems with the systems we built. I mean, there's really a few categories. I'd say there's the end user problems, and there are the problems of organizations. The end user problems that are the most severe, I mean, key management is one of the hardest problems in computer science, and like practical problems in computer science. Conceptually incredibly simple. Like a lot of computer science is built around taking something and abstracting it and make it very simple. It might be hard to do, but it's actually very simple to specify. And key management is probably the epitome of that, where it is you've got a key, you have a single thing that needs to be secured, and you need to manage it, and you need to do stuff with it. But it's very well defined and conceptually fairly simple. In practice, incredibly difficult to do well. If you look at the estimates of Bitcoin, I've seen like 5 to 10% of all Bitcoin that has ever been mined has been like lost or stolen at some point, and it's irrevocable if it's lost. All sorts of other systems like that. I mean, I've certainly had key management issues. Like I think only users lose keys or something like that is the phrase. But like I've had, if you look at my PGP history, I have like PGP like definitive key, PGP key 0, PGP whatever, when I lost the previous ones and things like that. So there's a whole range of problems where people lose their keys, or their key is compromised, perhaps shared without authorization, perhaps used for purposes other than intended. We also have the biggest area there, which is probably what happened to Vitalik, is account recovery. Account recovery, like, so there's concept of like the normal authentication flow for like a website or an application or whatever else, where you log in and maybe you're already logged in, or maybe you're logging in for the first time and it's like type in your password and log in. That all works pretty fine. What happens if you lose your password, or what happens if you lose your logged in key or whatever else? Basically every site, or 99% of sites, will give you an option to recover your password. And one of the craziest things is people in computer security think, oh, the attacker has to do exactly what we tell them they're going to do, or what we do, and follows our playbook. If they say we're going to, the way we do it is you have to type in your password to log in, that is not the only way to log in, because if you have this account recovery procedure and it is what to do if lost password, the attacker just pretends that they've also lost their password, and whatever mechanism you set up for that is probably the attack path that they will choose. And in this case, it is send an SMS to the phone number that's on the user account, even if they have TOTP 2FA enabled on their account. And that means anyone who has access to their phone number or control of the phone number can then get access to the account, which is not really a great situation, given that SIM swapping, SS7 attacks, all sorts of other stuff make it very, very difficult to rely on the security of cell phone. So this is a case where the cell phone providers have the incentive to sell you a cell phone, and they want to always make sure that if they want to sell you a new like $1,500 cell phone, you're going to walk out of the store with a $1,500 cell phone so that the salesperson can get their commission and they can get their $100 a month or whatever service. So there's no way they're going to put in substantial roadblocks to that process. And if you go in and you say, hey, I don't have my account password that I used when I set up my previous phone, they'll just let you create a new one. Or they have insiders that work for this company. Rather than making like $15 an hour selling phones, it would be a lot more economically remunerative to be the guy who sells access to rich and famous people's cell phone accounts on the side to various things. Or an insider that works at a company like Twitter or X or whatever would be able to access an internal control panel. And rather than making their like $60,000 a year as a customer support person, they might have a friend who does this or blackmails them into doing it, or just gets access to their computer. There have been so many hacks that have happened to major systems where it's a company that subcontracts to another company, which then subcontracts to another company, which subcontracts to like individual workers around the world who are not aware, certainly not compensated to the level that would provide security. But there was a contractor, I think in Colombia, that was involved in like a $500 million plus attack where that person's computer got compromised, and that was enough to get access to internal systems. So there's that. Access control generally, like at this passwords are essentially the worst means of authentication because they take a thing that humans are very bad at, remembering exact strings that are highly entropic, and force them to do it. You don't want to reuse the password. You don't want to, on multiple sites, you don't want to have a low entropy password. It shouldn't be derivable from any information about you. It shouldn't be stored in some sort of easily accessible format. All these things that make it very, very difficult for humans. And as a result, it's probably not the ideal foundation to build authentication technology on top of. And I mean, as I've said, one of the biggest problems is you build a system and it's designed for a certain level of risk. Like a phone, if you're just using it as a cell phone and you're using it to make calls and things like that, until AI and everything else, probably didn't matter that much if your phone was temporarily compromised, if you couldn't get access to it, somebody else had access to it, things like that. The real risk with the cell phone is, because if you call somebody and someone else has taken over the number and you talk to them and it's a different person, like it doesn't really cause that much problem. You'll be annoyed, but you'll think it's a misdial. That'll get fixed. The problem is if you have a computer system that uses this for authentication and sending a 6-digit number to that number is enough to gain access to an account, that is not an assumption that was built into the PSTN as the high security thing, and your consumer, potentially prepaid, potentially low value account was not built to secure the enterprise Okta interface for a major US casino or something like that. So there's all sorts of stuff like that where people take one system and it's designed with a certain level of security, and then other people build other systems that rely on it, and the combination is less secure than the insecure parts. There's also just the complexity thing. Like most people's full-time job is not computer security. Computer security is my full-time job, and I have so many systems to keep track of that like keeping track of every system's newest changes and things like that is basically a job for a team of people, not for any individual. If you've got a consumer, and you might think of it as a company thing, but as a consumer, if you're using, say, an Apple phone, Windows desktop, maybe you have a smart system in your house, a system in your car, all these things, you really should be keeping up to date on the security information that changes on these things, how they work, what makes them more secure, various issues. But doing that is basically a full-time job. And most people have other things they need to do. One, they don't really care about it. Some people don't have particular skills with this kind of stuff. It's very challenging if you're using systems that are badly supported. So maybe you have some like machine tool that's in your shop that was built in the 90s and somebody built some sort of interface for it, but they went out of business and you're still using it. So there's really no one to give you updates for it. There's like some weird forum on the internet that'll tell you like what's going on with this thing or not. So you've got all these things. It's a very hard problem, and it's basically not going to be solvable by most users. And that's all just stuff that's sort of inherent to the system. Then you've got outsiders, like you have scams and you don't really know who to trust. Like if you're an individual and someone comes up to you and says, hey, I have all the answers for you. You should use my thing for security. I'm going to recover your password and all this stuff for you. It's actually probably a scam. Like if you go to if you look in your spam box on email, you'll see all these like how to recover your whatever account things from actual scammers. And whenever some sort of new vulnerability comes out, one of the most common scams is an immediate, like, this is information about this scam. Click on this link to fix your problem. When there's a hardware security wallet for cryptocurrency, the Ledger wallets that are made in France that are basically pretty decent hardware. And they had something where their marketing database, which was running on some like shared marketing database company thing, that list got compromised. So now every 2 weeks at least, I still get spam to that mail address saying, oh, we need to help you recover the passwords to your account and things like that. And it's targeted from that attack. That is a very well-targeted list of people that were willing to spend $100 for a hardware device to secure potentially much more than $100 worth of crypto. So it's very targeted, and it is plausible that you might want to upgrade the firmware to something like this. So that's a problem. So we have that, and we've created that problem. So the individual situation is one thing, and then there's companies. Like most people are not individually that worth targeting. The level of effort that's going to be spent targeting them is moderate. It might be higher. Certainly if you're a famous like Hollywood person or something and somebody wants to get access to the photo roll on your phone, they're willing to do a lot of stuff to do that. Mine is full of like food photos and cats, so no one really cares about my photo roll. But depends on who you are and how much you're going to get effort. However, organizations are usually much more targeted because you can monetize that compromise much more clearly. And they have some of the same problems. They have the key management, account recovery stuff, but they have the complexity that rather than a single person who mostly can keep track of all the moving parts of their own life, I mean, maybe maybe it's an optimistic assumption, but at least most people have a chance of keeping track of things and remembering like when they used a certain vendor or whatever else. If you have a company that has even 5 people, but certainly if you have a company that has thousands of people, I don't know, out of a company with 15 people, I don't know every tool that everyone in the company uses. I don't know what the phone carrier that everyone's using, all the stuff. Like there's lots of little details that people have that no one centrally knows. And if you have thousands of people, it's essentially hopeless to do. So it's much harder for an organization to keep track of this stuff, plus a much higher level of risk. They do have more resources to spend in trying to solve these problems, but one of the things we've seen is over the past, especially 10 years, the tools that enterprises use, traditionally, like these big, complicated client-server applications or whatever else, have largely been replaced by almost exactly the same tools, or at least the same infrastructure that consumers and end users use. I mean, everybody uses the same iPhones and Android phones. They use laptops, they use Macs, or they use PCs. It's all like basically the same stuff that a consumer has. Different software in some cases, but largely the same tools. So they don't have that much of an advantage that you would think. And obviously, one of the problems is you can take one of these less secure systems and pivot. Then there's the whole class of things. So that's the problem for like the generalist thing. But if you're a software tooling developer or a service developer, you've got additional problems that you're actually building the stuff that other people rely on. And if what you're building is, say, a notepad application or something else that people use, or a security checkup monitoring thing that runs on a web extension or whatever else, whatever permissions you request from end users out there, like you build a web extension that's going to do something like maybe translates things, maybe looks at configs, has read-write permissions so you can make easy changes. One very tempting target is to attack one of your developers' source control for that thing and put something into that extension that's already widely deployed out there. Or you find somebody who's built an extension, say like 10 years ago, and they never really made any money from it, and they are willing to sell it to you for, say, $50,000, like some project that they've abandoned that is installed on hundreds of thousands of people's browsers. And once you buy that, you have essentially read-write access to everything on the web for a lot of these clients. And it would be under the branding of the previous company, maybe you release a little bit of stuff for a while, and you can do all sorts of really nasty stuff there. So that's happened a bunch of times. And the problem is there, you need to secure the entire pipeline from your developers, including various factors about the developers, all the way through how they manage their source code, what external dependencies they use. Maybe it's something built in Node.js and they use NPM, and you've got a bunch of exciting dependencies there that you don't have any direct control over, and no party really centrally monitors that much, so you've got that. And then how you build that and how you release it, because you're essentially releasing some piece of software. Maybe you're on something like a mobile operating system or extension where it's signed, so at least there's some integrity there of the code that you distribute is perhaps the version that the end user is installing, but you don't really know all the components that go into it. And unless you put a lot of effort into making sure that all those components are both secure and up to date, you're potentially releasing bad stuff to other people and victimizing them. Then, of course, there's the main problem of organizations. Organizations have they have all sorts of like social, psychological, sociological problems within an organization. You have the problem of organizational dynamics, insiders, and insider threats. An individual can mostly be trusted to act in their own interest. Mostly, I mean, they might be uninformed, but at least they have the same incentives. Like, I'm not going to cut off my own arm for the benefit of myself. Like, I'm going to then be without an arm. So unless I'm paid some amount of money that is incredible to do that, I have no incentive to do that. But if it's cut off someone else's arm, and especially if it's at extreme distance and you don't really understand what's going on there, and you don't really see the harm, and it's maybe a probabilistic thing, and there's a whole trolley problem and everything else. Like, you don't really suffer the same way if it's someone at a distance potentially suffering the consequences of your actions that you do. And organizations are that scaled to like infinity. You have organizations where simply not maintaining your patches on your computer can put other people, like end users, at risk that you'll never see. And you don't really know that, but you do know that if you install this patch, it's going to make you late for delivering, say, a presentation to somebody the next day. So you're going to make maybe a rational choice given the information you have at the time, but it's going to cause negative consequences for other people. So there's the whole insider thing, and that's just like the positive version of it. The negative part of it is you have that problem of the employee at a cell phone store that makes like $15 an hour. You have the problem of a customer support person. You have the problem of really anybody who is compensated less than the control that they have. It's not even the value they contribute, it's the control they have over a system and the risk exposure. So there's no way you can afford to pay every employee at a mobile phone company store enough to like overcompensate for the benefit they could get by selling out access to someone's account. So unless you build controls and stuff around that, you're going to basically set it up so that a rational but amoral actor is going to compromise you, and that sucks. So you have that, and you have all these infrastructure changes. Like, the complexity of a system that's used by 1,000 people is not 1,000 times that of a system used by one person. It's usually like some like geometric expansion of that. So you've got a fair bit of difficulty there, and obviously active adversaries. Like, this is all sort of the normal stuff that happens. We now live in a world that has geopolitical threats to various systems. Like, it's very unreasonable to expect a startup or even a mid-sized company or even a very large company to build a system as a private company to resist a nation-state attacker, like top 3 nation-state attacker from another country. And this happens to US companies from presumably Russia, China, other countries. I'm sure it happens to Chinese companies from US, Russia. I'm sure it happens to everybody, but building a system as a private entity and having to make a profit on that system with limited resources and actually shipping it to resist the level of attack that a nation state can put up against you is very, very difficult. So, I mean, this all sort of falls into the bucket of like yelling at problems that you can't really quantify or solve or anything like that, which is pretty unproductive. The other option is just accept it and accept that like this horrible world where you can't trust any of the infrastructure you use and everything else is not really going to change, and just like you'll live with it. I'm not really a fan of either of these options, so I'd like to talk about how we can fix this, and we can do some Q&A in a bit. But One option that people have is you can rely on government. UN, you can rely on your nation state government, you can rely on your local or your state government or whatever else. Unfortunately, having seen inside all of these organizations, or many of these organizations, they don't understand the problem, and they have completely different incentives than I do in the world that they want, or the trade-offs they're willing to make. I mean, in some cases, especially local governments, they do have somewhat aligned goals that they want. They want to live in a nice community. They want to create a nice community, but they don't have the same prioritization. They don't have the same ways of doing it. And ultimately, governments suffer that same problem that people do with security. Like, they believe they'll pass something or they'll do some law and people will obey the law and there won't be any unintended consequences to it. So you have that famous example of, was it Australia, where they had like a snake, a mouse problem, and they brought in snakes to solve that, and they brought in some other animal to eat the snakes and all this stuff. So they don't really think ahead, like many steps to solve these things. They'll do some law that potentially solves things. Like, for instance, the like child protection laws, the CSAM mitigation stuff that Apple was working on, that a lot of countries are requiring, stuff that UK is now doing to basically ban crypto. It's not so much that they want to ban crypto for its own sake, it's that they want to solve some other problem, and they prioritize that over this, and they don't look at the consequences of solving that intermediate problem. And they do have some goals that, I mean, don't really align. Like, helping them collect taxes is a pretty attenuated goal from, like, I don't really care if some other country in the world somewhere else can collect taxes. Like, it's theoretically maybe nice, but it's not really like a top priority for me. And if they want to re-architect how the entire financial system works so that every financial transaction has to include the beneficiary, source, and like 2 steps down, and make me sacrifice all my financial privacy, put it into databases that someone can then hack and get access to help them collect taxes, it's not really a good trade-off for me. So government, in some cases, has done some good stuff. A lot of times it's been kind of an accident that they've gotten something good out of the process they built, but it's probably not the primary tool that I go for. And it's also falls into this famous psychologist, sociologist thing that collective responsibility doesn't really work. Diffuse responsibility, it should be things that are under your control. Like, it's great to say, oh, we should do this thing where we're going to create a political campaign to try to pressure government to do something. All of the intermediate steps there, like creating the campaign, talking to people, all that stuff, doesn't actually fix any of the problems. It's only this theoretical future goal of getting government to pass an effective law that actually changes things in the world that would potentially solve it. But until you get to that point, you have accomplished nothing there's no intermediate progress toward it. And there's also a lot of costs. So you're taking, let's say you're willing to spend 200 hours a year on trying to fix computer security. Spending that 200 hours a year lobbying government, or building structures to like fundraise to lobby government to try to get them to pass a law to join organizations and everything else, probably not the most direct path to that goal. There might be some cases where it makes sense, but I also come from the perspective of living in a very large country, in a part of the country where I can't have any voting control over the country, so I have even less control over that than most people do. So what can I do? I think the most critical thing to remember here is to have a compass that points toward the actual objective you want. Like, we should agree on the kind of things we want these systems to do. If you just sort of build things as you go and don't have any particular goals in mind for them, and you just want to make things like marginally better in some sort of easy win kind of way. Like, I've been in a bunch of product meetings and project planning meetings with people where like, there's a roadmap, and the roadmap is a bunch of things that are incremental improvements. They're like competitive things. Nothing really as a true objective. It's sort of just like a path that they're following. And if you follow a random walk through the possibility of all systems, or possibility space of all systems, you're probably not going to get to any place that you particularly want to go. Another thing is you have to design for as many people as possible, or for the use case of your users. So if you're building a system for, say, dentists, you don't really need to take into consideration users that are not dentists. I mean, you need to make sure that it works in a societally beneficial manner, but if it's a system that's designed for a subset of the users, you need to make sure that that subset is well covered. But systems like a mobile phone, we have what, like 5 billion people in the world with mobile phones now, so essentially that's everybody. And a lot of these other systems, even if you start out building them for just your friends or small communities of people, they're going to have more and more people using them over time. So you need to have a pretty large audience that the thing is intended to reach. And that is a challenging problem, and it requires that you actually like leave your cave and your workstations and everything else and go out and meet normal people. Like, the people at a conference like this are representative of early tech adopters and a lot of very sophisticated people, but not really representative of like people's parents or emerging markets and things like that. And there's so many systems that are built maybe adequately, probably honestly not that adequately, even for like us in this room, that end up getting used by a lot of other people, and they don't have any voice in how this process works. So that's a major thing that you need to take into account, how these systems are actually used in the real world. And you need to remember that there are actual adversaries in the world. Like it is nice to have faith that larger organizations, companies, companies, and governments and everyone else have your interests in mind, are aligned and everything else. But unfortunately, that has historically not proven to be a very good assumption. Companies, at least, can generally be trusted to behave in their own self-interest to some degree because there's some level of competition and enforcing there. But honestly, it doesn't really apply that much to having aligned goals with you. Like, yes, they'll probably produce a better version of, like, the iPhone 15 is nicer than the iPhone 14 in a lot of ways that I like faster CPU, things like that. But it's not building a phone that allows permissionless innovation or whatever else. It's much more their own motivations. And governments have even less direct motivation, especially foreign government, like governments that you're not a party to. Like, I highly doubt that people in Ukraine have benefited by the internal politics within Russia. Like, this is like examples like that are perhaps very far to the extreme, but like governments are not as responsive to your individual needs, especially if you're not a political contributor, a direct participant, voter in a very small municipality, things like that. So you've got a lot of these problems. So we have all these problems, and the most exciting part of this is that we all build stuff, and we can talk about what it takes to build better systems with the idea of having actual objectives that we all want to meet. So happy to do the Q&A.
Awesome.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you so much for standing up here as one of the central architects of building and using the systems and admitting that even your own security is unattainable. Yeah,
I've kind of embarrassing, but I've lost an NFT to a MetaMask scam, and like stupid problems like send like 10,000 requests to get something through. And eventually you click and you're just like, screw it, just click it and it'll go away and steal an NFT. So even systems that I know that I've built some of the code for are, yeah, they fall prey to user problems.
Please raise your hand if you are honest enough to admit that this is you too. Mind-boggling, right?
And then the Vitalik situation was sad, but he was sort of a victim of backdoor addition of something. My friend DWR, who runs a crypto-based alternative to Twitter called Farcaster or Warpcast or whatever, has fallen prey to exactly the same problem about a week later, where he had a Twitter account and he was posting something, and somebody posted like, join the Golden King, Farcaster King Society NFT, and people clicked through it and lost the same way. So even if you have an example, like there's a theory that I have that it really sucks to be a victim of the first like 0 day on some problem, but it's not really on you, but it's like the fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me thing. If you're the second or the 10 millionth victim of the same vulnerability, that's kind of a problem in your own process. And yeah.
I mean, if you think of all the links that we started clicking on when link shortener services started, right, with Twitter, and you being an IRC channel, and you just, you know, there was a certain level of trust of who you're, well, honesty among thieves, even sort of thing. Like you're you're in that space.
Yeah, there's the idea that you should, like, if you're a developer of something and you build something in a way that is unsafe, like it works. So one of the problems is you can build something in a way that works fine when you build it in a certain way, but it trains users to do something that someone else can then take advantage of. Like if you're sending out emails about your product and they include links in the email that click and do stuff like that and say, enter your password here and all that stuff, users are then trained to look at their email, and if they see an email that they think comes from a trusted party like you, they'll go through and do the transaction. So that is a case where you're doing something that is safe when you do it, but then makes it conditions users to do things that are unsafe. So that's a problem.
So personally myself, I've only built, you know, retail or consumer or, you know, public-facing front ends for other projects, and going through all the usage of these tools with all your plugins and your release schedule and everything that you speak about. I want to ask another question of the audience. So personally, I don't click on anything. Does anybody have that strategy? I literally do not click on anything. I examine every single URL. Right?
Pretty much.
How rare is that? That's incredibly rare. I want to reference a piece that Quinn Norton wrote in 2014. Do you guys know who Quinn Norton is? Quinn Norton was a journalist that wrote for Wired and was incredibly, networked with all of us computer nerds, and was married to Aaron Swartz. And she wrote a piece in 2014 that is titled "Everything is Broken," which references, where it is that you started. So this was the topic of my talk yesterday, that we thought we were starting again and re-architecting things, and yet we've repeated the same thing, that we're fundamentally broken at the base layer. So my question is, do you, with the new generation of tools that are represented here in terms of sponsors and people that are working, what do you see on this new forefront of development and consciousness is going? Are we repeating again the same cycle, or is there an increased awareness for privacy and security actually in a broader community?
So about 20 years ago, I was convinced people would never pay for privacy or even security. I've changed that to people will pay for security in a lot of cases. Like certainly companies now pay for security. One of the biggest changes that's ever happened to a company was Microsoft, which in the 90s and before had incredibly bad security. Like they were the biggest security problem basically in the world. They basically got religion somewhere through and decided that they were going to focus on security. That seems to have in the last couple of years maybe fallen off a bit, but they as a company completely changed and decided to make their product secure. They essentially paused development on features for a couple of years and came up, re-architected a lot of their stuff and made it much, much more secure. There has been a lot of corporate awareness of that. There's also, on the consumer side, companies like, for instance, Apple have turned privacy and security into a feature that they're selling to users. Apple, to some, it might be an accident of history, but they don't generally sell advertising. And as we've seen from previous talks, like advertising is one of the greatest tools for an attacker against users, where you can get data on who is doing stuff. Like all this data that would be unfathomable that you'd be able to collect yourself is collected routinely and then sold for very small amounts of money relatively about their patterns of use of computers. And you can go from that to patterns of life. You can see secret CIA bases where people are like located. You can see historically the famous thing was like calling records for pizzas at the Pentagon in the US would go up like right before big invasions. Because
Chelsea Manning.
Yeah, yes, yes. All sorts of this stuff that has happened. And so there's some improvement there. I don't know. I think.
Can I make the question and the conflict even a little bit more narrowed for our audience? So I think that there's a big hope from those of us who are talking about privacy that zero knowledge proofs will be providing us with a thing and additional defenses, and then we're also talking about ZK EVMs. Yep. Whoa, am I wrong?
We have created in the last few years, like one thing is you can get the fundamental the science behind it, and then some of the engineering has gotten better. The user interface, the sociology, everything else around it has not kept up with that level of improvement. You can now go out and buy a cell phone and install Signal on it, or even WhatsApp now has reasonably good end-to-end ephemeral encryption. So you can install a messenger on your phone that works incredibly well at that layer to do secure messaging across devices. If you knew how much work individuals and governments put into doing exactly that thing in the 90s and early 2000s, this is pretty amazing. So some improvement has been made there, and ZK is going to be another quantum step above that, where you could actually build a system that exists and does not have to collect all this data, or if it does collect it, collects it in a way that does not make it accessible. Unfortunately, all the same commercial and regulatory incentives exist to make that system not work. So you can build a system today, if you're starting from scratch, if you know what you're doing, still very, very difficult to build these things, difficult tooling, everything else. You could build a system that did not collect any of this data from users. In, say, a financial system, you could build a anonymous financial transaction system using ZK as an asset on a system. You could do all this crazy stuff. Unfortunately, it would be illegal to do because you'd be falling afoul of Bank Secrecy Act, all sorts of OFAC, FinCEN regulations in the US, and then the equivalents in every other country, and then international pressure, which is part of the reason why other countries implement these things, is if you don't do this kind of stuff, you end up on a FATF watch list and your company gets, or your country gets debanked. So we've created a system where the regulations and corporate structure, incentives for profit and everything else have been set with the old technology from, say, pre-ZK, pre-crypto, pre-widely deployed internet world, and it is very commercially difficult or illegal to deploy those systems today, the new systems today.
I want to go even more granular. How are you going to detect a malicious attack embedded in an EVM?
That's one thing. I mean, there's an even simpler problem of today, cryptocurrency is kind of the Wild West in terms of how easily systems can be compromised or how frequently they're compromised. But the one saving grace of all the stuff is it's very hard to take a 130,000 Bitcoin score of stealing Bitcoin from somebody or some other equivalently large crypto thing and actually exfiltrate that successfully and anonymously to a thing that you control. Like there's companies like Chainalysis, Elliptic, everyone else who track essentially every transaction that happens on the
with technology they were admitting doesn't actually work at this point even.
Yeah.
But
true, yeah. But they track a lot of these things and it's very hard to do this. And then ZK systems would break that. So as soon as ZK systems are deployed, you lose all that stuff. And that's going to be a very challenging trade-off to make. Even exchanges are going to have a commercial interest in not having users hacked, because if a user keeps a balance of, like, I don't know, it doesn't really matter how big the money is. If it's all of your money, if it's $1,000 or $10 million, that's you're going to care about the same amount. So if you keep a huge balance on an exchange and it gets compromised, and the exchange says, "Oh, we can't do anything to help you," you're at the very least going to be very, very angry at that exchange and probably not using it again. And most likely, if enough people have that problem, it's going to either put the exchange into business or have commercial, like civil or criminal liability for people. So you can't build a system that is that vulnerable to systems. And so they'll have less incentive to deploy ZK privacy or cooperate with people that are doing ZK stuff. So until we solve these fundamental problems of the risk of getting hacked and things like that, it's going to be very hard to deploy these systems that we all want.
we have plenty of time, so very, very casually. So my personal agenda is that from the crypto anarchist perspective and our communal values, that we focused so much on the individual and not on institutions. So you're mentioning now, of course, an exchange has an interest. This doesn't happen. Institutions with all of our citizen data and everything like that. So I'm developing my own thesis that our messaging at some point, at some time, needs to move into the come out of the second realm and move back into the first realm and find the arguments for legacy institutions to implement what's also in their own interests. We need this functioning. Do you see a way forward with that? I know you referenced it with governmental in the slide. Are we waiting for a generational change where technological literacy is higher in decision-making classes and elites, or what's the path forward there that we actually have some sort of way to reform systems that we're
with government, at least in the US, less so in some other governments, we have the problem that essentially the government has been hollowed out. There's only elected officials and there's some civil service, but they're not usually the ones actually building systems or deploying the systems or even really evaluating systems. It's almost always they contract this out to companies. And the company contracts are written in such a way that they meet certain objectives and they get delivered. Very rarely is there's a specification written, often by another contractor, and it has to be met, and they're competing on price and meeting these objectives. But if you innovated in a way that you had a system that, say, one of the biggest hacks that happened to the US was this OPM database, where basically everybody who had a security clearance from the United States government had their system in a mainframe, and then they paid somebody to build a web front end to this thing. And that web front end was incredibly poorly managed and got hacked. And all the security questionnaires of basically everybody who, I don't remember if it was everybody who ever applied or everyone who was granted a security clearance, was compromised by an outside attacker, most likely China or possibly Russia or another state-level adversary. And this questionnaire included things like, who is a family member of yours who lives in a country that's hostile to the US or potentially at risk? And like it's basically what things could you be blackmailed about, you had to disclose. So they have a pretty clear step-by-step thing of like how to compromise basically every trusted government employee. So unfortunately, if somebody else had come to them and said, we're going to build this in a way that doesn't maintain this like honeypot of data, and we're going to instead build some other sort of like zero knowledge system for approving things, or even just we don't retain the data or things like that, they would not have won the contract. So until the contracting process is changed to include security and like meaningful security as part of it, that's probably not going to change. But once that changes, or once there's a way to, one of the things that happens is you end up with, there's a famous cliche that like militaries always fight the last war, but at least they learn the lessons of the last war usually, because they end up having a bunch of people die. So the problem is a lot of other entities do not learn from previous things.
And yet we have government agencies which are actually actively creating honeypots and attacking other nation states. It's not that we don't have the knowledge inside of the branches of government, which they don't want other branches of the government to implement because they're also involved in, Yeah,
the equities debate within like NSA and things is a huge thing where the attackers and the defenders don't really have equal footing. And there was a discussion about, like the problem is big countries and open societies, the US, Europe, other places, have a lot more systems out there that could be attacked. And potentially hostile organizations like small groups or whatever else have a lot smaller attack surface. So if you're going to, as a large organization like say the US government or as a US whatever, you probably would be better off if nobody had these tools to attack than if just you had these, than if everyone had these tools. So it's unreasonable that you build a system that you are only going to have access to. Like even the stuff the CIA built, like the Vault 7 stuff, ended up getting leaked to everyone and gets used for attacks. So you're essentially paying taxes to a government, which then creates tools that are then stolen and used to attack you, if not used to attack you directly. So, yeah.
Nerds in the room, you got any technical questions or additional thematic questions for Ryan that I haven't covered so far?
So the common theme I've seen in you is that we have like a system that gets commonly used, and then we build solutions that are not or they suppose the system is secure enough. GSM would be one of them. So do you think about any others like this, or what would you recommend if I actually want to build a system and have some recovery, what to do without the phone?
Yeah, I think the sort of meta answer to that is that what we need is a better way to measure the security of things, because there's the thing, if you don't measure something, you're not going to make progress toward it. And we're really, really bad at computer security generally, but we're exceptionally bad at measuring the security of computer systems. I mean, in physical security systems, like say safes, there's organizations like Underwriters Laboratories, which was created by the insurance industry, that does things like a standardized attack on this safe using this range of tools, not including explosives or torches, should take 15 minutes or more. And that's a very well quantified thing. They publish videos of attacking the safe with like angle grinders and everything else. And you can be pretty confident that it's probably going to take at least 15 minutes to attack the safe. And it's going to create this level of noise around and everything else in the environment. So if you have that, what you do as a security officer is you say, we're going to have guard patrols that happen every 10 minutes, and then you'll catch somebody in the middle of this attack. That doesn't really exist in computer security. Computer security systems fail in a very brittle way, where just like some metals or plastics or whatever else, things like steel will sort of bend before they break. With computer security stuff, there's not usually many indicators before the system is compromised. And it gets compromised very quickly and often undetectably. You don't know that a system was compromised 6 months ago, and they can use it to get more and more data. So one of the things that is probably the Manhattan Project thing that should be created to make security better is a better way of measuring the security of systems as deployed. And then from there, we can look at which systems are better and which ones are worse. And then from there, we can start specifying a system needs to be this secure for this kind of data. As far as GSM, I basically don't trust my phone at all. Like the phone itself, like the baseband is completely untrusted to me. mostly trust the OS to a reasonable commercial degree. I don't trust it against super targeted attacks, but it's a reasonably secure computing platform. And I would trust applications like, say, Signal on top of this untrusted network a lot more than I would trust any sort of encryption that's built into the network layer built by telecoms. Like, one of the crazy things about industries is the more regulated an industry is, it becomes very aligned with the interests of its regulator. So a phone company is very attuned to the regulations of, say, FCC and then a bunch of other government entities. So if they wanted to compromise security, they have a much better input than trying to convince Moxie Marlinspike that it's a good idea to put a backdoor into Signal. So I would say systems that are built like closer to your use case are probably in general better. Oh, and quick shill moment. One of the cool things about insurance is it actually makes an easy way to quantify. Just like the UL created the standards for safes, and fire safety is created by the insurance industry. One of the reasons why I like working at an insurance company is we get to create standards and quantify things for risks in our space. And hopefully that gets applied to more and more problems.
So do you think we can ever get a system like that's provably secure? So I can imagine if we have a very tiny program, it could be provably secure, but maybe for a complicated system, we could have this in the future.
Yeah, there's a whole area called proofs of correctness, like formal verification, everything else for software. There's probably not so much for hardware, but for software, you can prove certain functions do what you're specified. The problem is those are usually very tiny by necessity, and in many cases, they don't directly map to what you expect. So like, it's that problem of everyone's afraid of AI taking over the world, where the paperclip problem, where you tell it, like, make your paperclip factory produce as many paperclips as possible, as efficiently as possible. If you tell them that, then the thought experiment is it'll convert all matter in the universe into paperclips. If you write a formal specification for a piece of software, either you've made a mistake in that specification in some cases, or you don't understand the consequences of it, or it's just such a tiny piece that I can build a system that's completely unbreakable. Like, I can build an unbreakable like door, and I just go through the wall. So there's a lot of systems like that where the formal proofs of correctness are inadequate for the overall system security. The scope, like one very good strategy is trying to reduce the scope of systems as much as possible. Like, I certainly trust single-purpose devices a lot more than I trust like a multi-function desktop computer to do stuff. And building systems that are simpler and simpler does make a lot of sense.
So I have one final question, and then we'll move on. In the bell curve of your career, do you believe that there's been more of a move from black hats into white hats, or white hats into black hats?
There are a lot more people on both sides than ever existed in the past. Like, there are people in the computer security industry that were in the industry 30 years ago, but most people that are in this industry have been in the industry for less than 10 years on both sides. So I think, and also most people in the world are not in the computer security industry, and to a great degree, we need to bring more people into industry. People who are, like, I would certainly trust a doctor who also knows, like a 8 out of 10 doctor who also knows security to a reasonable degree more about medical security than somebody who knows nothing about medicine and knows a lot about computer security. Like, a lot of these things, you have a lot more value by being a domain expert in some real domain plus computer security than if you just are a computer security expert.
Ryan, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you. Thank you.